Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Colin McBride, how's it going, buddy?
Going great. Nice to be with you here.
Yeah, welcome to the Ethics Experts. So you are an AI governance guy. AI is what everybody is talking about. It's top of mind for everybody. Before we get into that, though, I want to talk a little bit about, I always love to start with what kind of kid were you growing up? And how did your path bring you into our space?
Yeah. So growing up, I was a little bit of a unique kid, I would say. I had friendships across a lot of different diverse groups, kind of deliberately didn't try to pin myself to a single identity or clique. And I think in like that, a natural occurrence was just wondering about like the social fabric and rules that held society together. So that kind of led me to study sociology with an emphasis in criminology in college. And without a clear kind of graduation path from there, post-grad, I kind of just got thrown into insurance sales, started leveraging some people skills. And once I became a top performer there, I saw an opportunity to really utilize the skills I developed in my studies in sociology, like research-bound skills and things of that nature, and shift gears towards more of a compliance-oriented position.
So how has that background in sociology, how has that influenced how you practice compliance? How does that lens that you've acquired drive the way you interact from a compliance perspective with other stakeholders in the organization?
Definitely. So I think from the sociology perspective definitely gives you a consumer first lens. So a big part of compliance and AI governance as well is advocating for the consumer and making sure that, they're not adversely impacted in a way that's illegal or against the law. So being able to take the consumer's point of view is a key component of being able to evaluate risk from a compliance perspective.
Yeah, and I guess the consumer is not just the client of the organization, it's any, quote unquote customer within the organization.
Exactly. Yeah. In the insurance space, a consumer could be your insured, or it could also be the agent as well.
Right. So where were you on your journey, on your career journey, where AI kind of started landing on your radar and you made the decision to kind of start running toward that AI governance, side of the pool, so to speak?
Yeah, definitely. So I
guess you could be swimming toward that, I guess. But please go ahead.
Yeah, swimming, I could say that. So yeah, I think like a lot of other people, the release of ChatGPT was just like kind of an aha moment, like, wow, this is a huge change in technology and this is going to impact everything. Kind of for a little bit further down the line from there, when the NAIC released their model law on AI, that really brought it into the insurance realm and made it real for me that this was going to become a part of my job going forward. So kind of utilizing or recognizing that the laws and the technology were new to everyone. This is a rare moment that I could be on a somewhat level playing field with a lot of compliance veterans. And so I really wanted to, jump into that as quickly and with as much emphasis as possible.
So how has that been? I'm kind of talking about the level playing field thing.
Yeah.
This is a new technology and it's kind of wiping the slate clean in a lot of ways. So I find some people feel a little bit off kilter because of that, where maybe some of their old frameworks don't really apply with the same sort of, some of those old things don't sort of gain the traction or give them the handles that perhaps they expected them to provide kind of in this new era where things are moving so fast. How has that felt sort of being on this level playing field? And what have you sort of noticed with some of your counterparts in other industries, other organizations who maybe are, older? What have you learned from that?
Yeah, I think a key component is just being open to learn new things. Like a lot of the technology verbiage and AI kind of language is different and not like the normal legalese that a lot of compliance folks are used to. So kind of being open to learning that new technology and being able to work with and develop a common ground and language with developers is essential so that both people understand the responsibilities of their party.
So For people who are not in the insurance industry, who are maybe in other highly regulated industries, like just kind of give us the high level overview. What makes insurance like uniquely challenging or uniquely interesting in the context of AI governance?
Definitely. Yeah. So it goes both ways, right? Uniquely challenging and interesting. Kind of to set the tone, insurance has had congressional state level regulation for the last 80 years, going back to the McCarran-Ferguson Act of 1945, meaning that insurance and the use of technology in insurance applications is regulated at the state level. And so not only does this cause variance between states, but it causes variance between industries as well, right? So you have finance folks, you have people in energy industries. Those are also highly regulated industries, but the application of AI in those industries is going to be different, even within the same state. So I think that state nuance as well as industry nuance is a key component of why it's challenging.
So how important was it? Oh, please go ahead.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was going to go into interesting next, so let's stay on that.
Okay, yeah. Let's kind of pivot into interesting in a second then. How important then is it for you to have a good grasp of that regulatory nuance or that regulatory complexity in order to better understand how AI governance is going to need to intersect with this highly regulated with this highly regulated industry that you're a part of?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely incredibly important. However, the landscape right now is moving so quickly. So, new laws are being introduced all the time. Laws are getting repealed. Our administration is trying to input, federal overbearings. So there's lots of kind of changes. So while it's important to know the nuances of the law, it's also you have to kind of stay on top of the changes in that the laws are going to be changing quickly for the near future. So kind of recognizing your ability to take in new guidance and act on that with efficiency is I think, one of the most important facets.
I'm not trying to like lead the witness here, but it seems like you view a lot of this as an opportunity as opposed to a threat, which some people might, frame this as or view this as because of all the chaos, because of all the change. How do you think about this sort of undulating risk surface that we're traversing across?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, technology is always going to be seen as a risk, especially as a new risk. So you look at the internet, you look at the .com era, like these were all kind of looked at as very risky ventures at a certain point. I think AI is going to be the exact same way. What's important is that AI, since it's autonomous and has the ability to act on its own, is that we incorporate the controls and mitigations from the start so that we don't get to a place where everyone doesn't trust this technology and it's not useful.
So so let's kind of pivot into the interesting side of the house. Okay, so we talked about what makes it challenging. We talked about the regulatory complexity, the changing regulations, the fact that this new technology is sort of touching everything. What makes it uniquely interesting, though? Because I think that, again, what I find is, as I talk and I dive deep with people that are experts in, one industry, whether it's insurance or healthcare or whatever, it's always interesting to see these sort of through lines across industries, especially across highly regulated industries, because there's always so much to learn. I'm a fan of like mixed martial arts, and you'll see, the best guys are always training other styles. They're they're going to a different gym and they're learning some techniques for jujitsu or, you know what I'm saying? There's all these different sort of schools.
Absolutely.
And I think getting some visibility and getting some perspective from somebody that's in a different industry can often give us new clues or new frameworks that are probably applicable on our side that maybe we just haven't looked at the world in that way. So what's so interesting about it from your standpoint?
Yeah, so I mean, and I think that's a great point, right? So the way that people are using this technology is it feeds off data. So the more data you can provide it in a more organized and a readable and usable fashion, the better it'll act. Within the insurance industry specifically, I find it extremely interesting on how segmented you can create or you can identify and analyze risks. So the ability to segment particular classes, industries, and price individual risk according to characteristics of a business or an individual is extremely interesting. And the amount of data that's there to make those decisions is just becoming more and more. So recognizing kind of connection points between data that might not have been recognized before, and you can get that, to your point, from other industries. It doesn't have to be only within your industry.
One interesting thing about it, I kind of come from a finance background, and one thing I've always that's always seemed interesting to me, just about from a finance 101 standpoint, is that you can kind of price anything. You can price any project or any stock based on a certain set of assumptions, and I think there's a corollary from an actuarial perspective within insurance that makes that industry sort of very risk minded. How as opposed to something, I'm not saying that everyone's not risk minded, but there's a certain sort of objectivity or quote unquote pricing of or a calculation of risk that's you see much more prevalently in finance or insurance that doesn't exist to that same extent in manufacturing or in healthcare or whatever, regardless of the fact that like we all want to reduce risk and make our businesses run more smoothly. How has that sort of that pool that you're swimming in, that sort of like risk minded actuarial, we can price all the risk because we have access to all this data, how has that created talk to me a little bit about that environment and how the application and the adoption of the AI governance has either been easier or like more difficult than it might be in another industry?
Yeah, I think there's lots of facets there. So importantly, like at least in the insurance industry, there's kind of not two, but like two dichotomies of carriers, right? You have your startup, your new carriers, and you have what we call legacy carriers. So legacy carriers, and rightfully so, tend to be a lot more risk averse. So kind of introducing these new technologies into legacy carrier is going to come with a lot more scrutiny than it is in a new carrier or in a startup mode. So I think that's incredibly important to recognize. And with that comes resources. Legacy carriers have a lot more resources to throw at risk management versus a startup doesn't have as much. So being able to effectively measure risk and point your resources and time at what's most apparent or risky to your business or consumer is of the utmost importance.
I'm not trying to talk out of both sides of my mouth here, but every industry is trying to reduce risk, right? In healthcare, they don't want misdiagnoses. They don't want something to go wrong in the operating room. So like everyone has this sort of like risk radar or this like sensitivity to risk. But it's always interesting to me how sometimes that tendency for like risk reduction that's pretty pervasive regardless of industry ends up not sort of automatically translating to the governance perspective. And so I'll give you an example. I had somebody on the show recently who works in a large accounting firm, and an accounting firm, like what are they doing? They're in the assurance business, right? Like they're coming in and they're doing financial audits. They're finding risks in the operations of the organization. And so all those people at the board level, at the executive level, these are all very like risk-minded people. However, the basic things, such as, in the context of a compliance program where more speak up reports is healthy, not as opposed to like less speak up reports being the thing, was not initially apparent to that leadership. So she had to do some smart work and some persuasion to help turn those light bulbs on at the top so that those folks could apply this well kind of curated lens of risk, that they look at the entire world and all of their all their clients and their advisory services through to see how that like actually applied in the governance framework. Have you seen kind of a similar trend where you have all of these, risk-minded people, again, whether you're a startup or you're a legacy provider, the name of the game in insurance is like accurately pricing risk and, matching your assets and liabilities to the risks that are likely going to kind of come down the pike for the policies that you have out there. Have you seen some disconnect from the application of this, again, well-curated risk lens that, inhabits the minds of all leaders within this industry and its application to AI governance in particular?
Yeah, definitely. I do think that, let's see. So the major thing from like a risk perspective, I believe, is instituting the same controls that you have. So there's general controls that have been in place for years and centuries, especially in the insurance industry, but in industries at all. So how do you shape those controls particular to this technology? We're not doing something new here. We're using a technology to create efficiencies. We're using a technology to create better decisions. So how do we reinforce the controls that we already have in place with this new technology is the question we want to ask.
Yeah, but it's so interesting because on the one level, again, I'm a guy who speaks out of both sides of his mouth
Hey,
often.
it's totally fine with me.
On on the one side, it's like, yeah, this is no different than anything else. This is just a new risk that's coming on our landscape. It's a new technology that we have to kind of see what the borders are of and apply or tweak or make more flexible the controls that we already have in place. To your point, we're not like starting from scratch. Okay, so
Right.
that's kind of one side of this sort of polarity. On the other side of it, though, there's almost like a new dimensionality of risk because AI use cases are so myriad. Like there's so many different use cases.
Yeah.
I talk about this a lot that even in my own organization, I'm consistently surprised by the ingenuity and the creativity of people on my team in building cool things and automating things that weren't even on my radar. So the agentic nature of AI does add like a new layer of risk, like a new dimension of risk,
Hmm.
and the speed of it as well. I had my good friend Reed Blackman. Do you know him?
I'm not familiar now.
Oh, you would love this guy. He just put out this book called The Ethical Nightmare Challenge, and
Okay.
it's kind of trying to answer this problem where there's this new dimensionality of risk. Like we don't have narrow AI anymore. It's moving
Hmm.
toward, AGI, but let's say, we're only living in this sort of agentic age right now,
Right.
which has kind of exploded the sort of risk surface of AI in terms of how it intersects with the daily operations of a business. And he kind of talked about this cautionary tale of several large Fortune 500 companies that, it took them 6 months or 9 months to get their AI policy approved. And given the speed and the velocity of AI use case expansion, that policy is now,
Yeah, not
it doesn't
relevant.
apply. It doesn't,
Yeah.
it like doesn't account for all that kind of risk. So how do you kind of think about these kind of two ends of the spectrum? It's just another risk and we have a bunch of controls in place and those things can be flexed and so forth, and the rate of change and the kind of framework that we need to account for the ever expanding sort of pervasiveness and use cases of this technology.
Yeah, so I think one of the first points I want to touch on is you emphasized the speed at which this technology can act, right? So, if you implemented an automation previously prior to Gen AI or, wherever we are with agentic AI, that automation could work only so fast. Now we have
Yeah.
AI tools that can go through millions of records in minutes. If you make a mistake, the consequences of that are significant to the consumer, to a business, what have you. So I think while the controls we want to put in place are the same, the kind of emphasis and testing and scrutiny we have to put towards those controls has to be increasingly heightened due to the ability of AI to act, at increased speeds. And it's only going to get faster, as time goes on, as we move towards AGI, as you mentioned.
So, so that's kind of a good segue into this next question of like, from a practical standpoint, then like, what does it look like for a company to build a functioning, flexible AI risk management framework that can kind of keep pace with this rate of change? Like, how should compliance folks, many of whom are, if not leading, they're at least a part of the AI governance, program at their organization, how should they think about building that kind of flexibility into their AI management framework, risk management framework?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things, and you've probably heard this by and large by a bunch of people, but a cross-functional committee, having representatives at the table from security, from compliance, from privacy, from risk management, all of those core functions need to be at the table to effectively address this. As you mentioned, the technology is moving so quickly. So in order to appropriately kind of forecast your stances, I think it's important to develop like a defined company strategy. So you have an overall company strategy of how your company operates, but then how do you implement AI there? How does AI help you meet your company goals? Right. Once you have that, you're going to want to develop principles, right? So what do we believe AI should be doing for our company, and how do we want to develop it from the ground up? These are things like, inclusive growth, sustainable development, human-centered values, transparency and explainability, core components of AI that allow individuals to trust and believe in this technology going forward, so that there's not a guess and check type outlook always.
Do you feel like there's a disconnect between the AI governance minded folks in an organization and the call it like individual contributor minded folks that are trying to leverage this technology to meet an outcome, to sell more, to generate more profitability? Is there a different sort of risk aversion there? And like, if there is, how do we better bridge that from like a corporate governance perspective?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is, right? From an individual contributor perspective, outside of a compliance function, you're looking to make your job more efficient. You want to be better at your job. If you can use a tool to get there, you're going to do that for the most part. What is extremely important from the compliance perspective is developing guidance that can be universally applied to these tools, right? So things like de-identifying data minimalization, so that you're only providing the tool with enough so that it can get your job done, but you're not putting the company at any additional risk.
Yeah, I do like that answer, and I think that answer is right. What I want to kind of talk a little bit about is how important is it for those who are thinking about, who are kind of approaching this whole thing from the governance standpoint, from the AI risk mitigation perspective, how critical is it for them to be AI fluent? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, I look, maybe I'm being too broad of a brushstroke here, but I think I've just kind of surmised that there's a lot of AI, there's a lot of people on the AI governance committees that are not like AI nerds. Do you need to be an AI nerd in order to like be effective in AI governance, do you think?
I don't think you need to be an AI nerd, but you definitely need to be aware of the verbiage, right? But it goes both ways, right? I think developers need to be aware at a high level of these laws, just as we need to be aware of the technologic verbose that allows for effective communication between the two groups.
But like, can you synthesize that, or can somebody synthetically acquire that? Like, can I ever be an expert on swimming without getting in the pool? Or like, if I got to build pool safety, do I need to be somebody who is swimming a lot in order to build a pool safety governance framework?
I mean, do you have to be? I don't think so. I mean, there's multiple kind of variations or ways you can approach that, right? You can put a wall around the pool so no one can go in. You don't know how to swim, but you're providing you're providing safety for those people to not fall in. However, that's not going to get you to where you want to go. That's not going to allow you to exercise, which is the goal of swimming a lot of times, right? Yeah. Similar with AI, we can't just put a broad box around it. We have to incorporate we have to incorporate use case specific guidance so that the individual is aware of what they're doing and also aware of the potential risks that are available from that process.
Yeah. I think the challenge with that though is like use case specific guidance. If that's coming down from on high, a prerequisite of that is a knowledge of those use cases. And I've just seen like use cases totally explode. So how does the organization, and again, maybe let's not even put it on the compliance person or the AI governance committee, how do we keep pace with all these different use cases and provide sort of ample guidance without falling into the temptation to let's just wall it up. It's too much. Right. It's too complex. The safest thing is to like just kind of put a wall around the pool.
Right. Yeah. And that's an extremely difficult challenge that I think a lot of companies are still looking to figure out. Right. So you have a procurement process where a lot of these tools come through. There's one use case usually presented during the procurement process. Yeah. Okay. You approve it for that use case. Then you open that tool up to the whole company. Now everyone's got ideas about how they want to use that. How do you oversee all the use cases that a given tool is being used for? I mean, it's extremely difficult. So, up front, being able to provide guidance as to kind of the riskiest uses, and then asking your folks to come forward when they want to utilize a tool in that way so that you can provide the proper guidance, I think is essential. However, it's an extremely difficult relationship to build, right? You want to have that ability so that people come to you for guidance, but also aren't worried that they're going to blow up their spot or have to completely change their process.
Yeah. I kind of came up in accounting, and there are, seven or so like accounting principles that guide all, accounting decisions. Okay. Right. So that's simple. That's seven things that you have to like understand and learn from a principal perspective. And then you have sort of the other end of the spectrum. You have this tax code where if we printed it out, it would be probably taller than, me on your shoulders or something, right? which has to articulate kind of every single scenario. That's a really hard thing to balance. Like from, to bring this metaphor into the AI governance thing, like we can't provide guidance for every single thing. And then if we just rely on principles, we have to make sure that the people who are making those decisions on a day-to-day basis and how they're going to leverage this technology or which tools they're going to get are at least running through the right, the right kind of lens or like the right, filter before we just let the agent loose in the organization, so to speak.
Definitely. And I think that's why you have to place some key accountability on leadership. Leadership has to be trained in the risk tolerance of the company. And then it's up to that leader to decide, is this tool going over and above the risk tolerance that my company allows? Not every single use case, by and large, unless you're a company that has the resources to do so, is going to come through compliance. So being able to educate your cross-functional partners so that they can take your risk perspective and your risk tolerance and apply it to their team without having to come back and forth and create that dialogue every time is essential.
Yeah, it is essential. It's just, again, it's to me, it's such an exciting time. I think change is exciting. And I think this new technology has, so many uses and can have such an impact on an organization and on individual jobs and departments and stuff like that. But along with, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Every opportunity has a sort of an equal and opposite, threat. And it's hard to know what the bounds of that, those things are when things are moving this fast. What do you think the biggest kind of operational risks companies overlook when deploying AI in core functions, whether it's with insurance or more broadly across other industries? What are those big things that companies seem to get wrong?
Yeah, as far as getting wrong, there's not many, hard real world examples yet, but what I see as being one of the most critical, kind of gaps or areas of influence is going to be the intersection of privacy and AI governance, right? So the ability to control and taper the data that is being supplied to AI so that it's only the data necessary to make the decision, or it's de-identified and anonymized in a way that it can't come back to the individual. The amount of personal or privacy related data that a company has is definitely varies significantly depending on industry, but by and large, a lot of them have some. As you grow in company size, the risk that you take on is extreme, and without proper controls, the devastating like financial, reputational, and regulatory harm that a privacy incident can cause can be inescapable in some aspects.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see like over the next 30, 20 years, whatever, how privacy laws change. At some level, the laws that we have in place are a function of the concerns that, the human beings that those laws govern have. And if you think back to like your grandparents' generation, or think back to Generation Alpha or whatever's the newest one, there are very different views on privacy.
Absolutely.
The former, my grandparents, they wouldn't even read a freaking credit card number over the phone, right, and like my son is fine putting, his debit card number in any app. He has like no sensitivity to it. He has like no concern to it. So like, I wonder how those laws and those concerns are going to change just as the generations kind of continue to shift, and the composition of our, population has kind of a very different kind of view on this thing that is, super critical right now.
Absolutely. The kind of generational outlook is extremely influential to how these laws are built, how they're verbalized, how they're created, and how they're enforced. So, even the same law, that privacy law that was created in the 80s or the 90s, the way it's being enforced now is extremely different. The tools that it applies to are extremely different. So regardless of the law itself, the new people and new experiences that those people are bringing in, along with the background and previous experience with the law, are all going to intersect and create a new understanding.
So let's talk about like how do you evaluate, AI tools coming into the organization? Do you have kind of a process or a checklist or some kind of a mental model that allows you to kind of gauge the risk of it or something like that? Like, how do you kind of think about the adoption of new tools? Because like they're freaking in everything now,
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think the first and foremost, the most important step is to insert yourself in the procurement process. Adding an AI governance review into the procurement process is extremely important. As you mentioned, even tools that aren't necessarily AI have AI working in the background. And so, having that kind of, that input is extremely important in addition to, your financial, your security, your enterprise accounts, all of those different steps, your legal. So yeah, first inserting yourself in that process so that you can give your risk assessment and influence the contracting portion of the review. I think that's extremely important. Some of like the documentation and stuff that would be reviewed is fairly standard: privacy policy, data processing agreements, MSAs. However, taking these from an AI governance perspective is going to present different risks than the legal team's review, than the security team's review. And so kind of reviewing those documents with that lens is extremely important. And then having that open line of communication with the submitter to fully understand the use case, what our data exposure looks like, and not only what it looks like during the trial, but what's your vision for the future? How do you see this tool evolving, and what other teams may become and other data might become processed by this tool?
That's a good model. I want to pivot now a little bit to the kind of the global thing here. Okay, so you have kind of a global, a global lens that you look at a lot of this stuff through due to some of your recent education as you've been getting kind of deeper into this AI governance, world. What do you think? And so I think the EU AI Act is maybe a little bit different in structure and in spirit than how the US is thinking about it. I think broadly we have this sort of deglobalization happening that seems to be kind of a trend that has maybe picked up some steam over the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. Where do you think we're going with this? And so you obviously live something like this on a more micro level with all these different sort of state jurisdictions and all this this web of different regulations that you have to kind of weave through. How do we think about this? Or like, what do you think us in the US can learn from the EU approach and vice versa? And how do you think we should kind of think about this sort of spirit or structural differences between these different treatments of AI at that sort of, I know EU is not a country, but like from the EU versus the US level?
Yeah, definitely. So kind of a little bit of background in just how it's different. So the EU AI Act is significantly more prescriptive. It has explicit risk category definitions, mandatory high risk conformity assessments, as well as a registry. So all high risk tools have to be input into a registry. It also has a uniform framework that interacts with, but largely supersedes member country laws, I'm sorry, as opposed to the US, as you mentioned, where we have 50 plus jurisdictions with sort of a patchwork approach that doesn't have much commonality between it. And when it does, there's variance across industry, jurisdiction within, things of that nature. So what I think like the US can learn from the EU would be that like a more overarching framework supplemented by minor state or country or county or whatever level regulations and enforcement is going to be an easier to understand for compliance professionals as well as to operationalize. So that's going to be able to be put in force quicker. The current state-by-state definitions and requirements of the U.S. continuously increase the burden of the regulatory compliance departments that already have limited resources.
Yeah, it's like the same thing on the privacy side, right? Like the privacy laws are
very much so.
So then how does a business, in the context of maybe it's an international business, or maybe we're kind of thinking at some point there's probably going to be this sort of overarching thing that you described. What do you do in the absence of that? Like, is it a lowest common denominator type of an answer and saying like, well, whatever the most restrictive things are, it's easiest to just kind of roll that out kind of across the entire operation? Like, how do you think about these sometimes contradictory or these kind of patchworks that we have to kind of weave our way through?
Yeah, so I think that is really going to be reflective of the resources what that the company has to put towards this, right? So, like as you said, least common denominator is going to be the approach of a lot of companies who have minimal resources to put towards this type of effort. However, companies that are global, especially with operations in the EU, may have more capabilities to create specific technologies that, based on where the user is, where the data is, what industry they're in, they can kind of change how, or they can change accordingly to fit the requirements of that regime.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's like just so all, it's like the wild, wild west right now, it'll be interesting to see over the next, this next chapter, kind of where the dust sort of starts to settle.
Yeah,
So
and that's it's both challenging, but it's also the fun part of it, right?
yeah, it is the fun part of it. There's so much opportunity in change. There's so much opportunity in, when things are moving around. And I think it's a big opportunity for ethics and compliance to like jump in this pool, so to speak, and add significant value and kind of increase sort of status or power or influence or whatever you want to call it within the organization, because it's top of mind in every board meeting. It's top of mind for all of leadership. And I think when we can come in and provide some smart guardrails that allow us to not slow, that don't cause us to slow the business down, but can really help us accelerate more quickly toward those organizational objectives, it can turn some light bulbs on with respect to kind of the strategic lever that ethics and compliance can be within an organization. I want to talk a little bit about like risk ethics and like org behavior. Where do you, in your experience or from your standpoint, where do you think like AI governance and sort of traditional compliance programs, like where do they align and where do they kind of clash?
Yeah. Great question. So I think we touched on the clashing a little bit already. So I'll kind of briefly go over it with my input, but I think like the way that they clash is that technologic understanding of how AI models and tools work, right? So many compliance professionals start without awareness, for example, that, different models are trained differently, right? Supervised learning is trained on labeled data. That's good for things like demand forecasting. Unsupervised learning is trained on unlabeled data. That's good for customer segmentation. There's also reinforcement learning that can go individually or on top of those. And so now we're starting to see AI tools that combine these training methodologies so they can be applicable to more general use cases and more generally. However, if you don't understand how the tool is trained kind of at an elementary level, it's hard to evaluate what is going to be the best use for that tool and what the preceding risks will be.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what you were saying before on the importance of, I don't know, you don't have to, be a mechanic to kind of understand how an engine works or
Right.
to understand how a car works. But you should kind of understand how the car works if you're going to be able to have any kind of coherent conversation with a mechanic. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly. Well, and two, like if you're going to go to a mechanic, you want to be able to trust that person, right? If you don't have an understanding of what you're evaluating, how can you do so?
Exactly. So, I'm just really fascinated by this question because I get so many kind of different answers, and we kind of touched on it a little bit from the compliance perspective or from the business perspective. But I want to think about this now from like the individual stakeholder perspective. Like, what do you think is an example of an AI risk that people in the business tend to underestimate? Many times, the classic salesperson, they're only looking at upside. Okay. They all have happy ears and, everything's going to be kind of rainbows and butterflies. Those are not people that are really again, from like an archetypal perspective, are not usually good downside consideration type thinkers. You have other kind of more highly analytical people that always, they have a real knack for seeing how a plan might go wrong. Right. So, what are some of those risks that some of those people within the business tend to underestimate from a, AI risk standpoint?
Yeah, I think that one key one is accuracy degradation over time. So a lot of people will come with an AI use case. They say, look how great this is. It's improving efficiency by whatever percent. However, the continuous evaluation and testing of unforeseen variables or variables that weren't present when this tool was initially implemented, a lot of times is lacking. And so while you may be very happy with how it starts, over time, these things can unravel very quickly. And so having that ongoing maintenance is a key component that I think is overlooked a lot. Additionally, and going along with that is undertrained user bases. So if the user doesn't know the basics of like how AI works, for example, that it's probabilistic, that it's prediction oriented, they can't prompt effectively, they can't evaluate outputs critically. It's hard for them to test for accuracy or even select appropriate use cases in the first place.
Well, and I mean, think about just like how human beings are. Like, we don't like revisit that many decisions. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I don't know,
Absolutely.
you meet somebody, maybe I'm projecting here, but like you meet somebody, I just think everybody has like kind of two buckets that they put things in, good and bad. And so you meet somebody, and you're like, I don't, you're kind of holding them in between these two buckets. And then at some point you're like, okay, they're going to go in the good bucket. You're not constantly reevaluating all the apples in that basket. You're like, okay, these are the good apples. These are the bad apples. And I think that natural human thing, because like we're bombarded with so much stimulus, we think in stereotypes, we take these sort of mental shortcuts. I mean, there's books and books written about blind spots and cognitive errors that are all kind of wired into our brains. This tendency to sort of say, okay, wow, these are great answers. This sounds like a great answer from the AI, and you ostensibly put sort of AI, writ large in this good bucket, causes a headwind for your critical reevaluation of the answers that are coming back from it, which can open up kind of some of these ethical nightmares that are kind of the basis for my friend's book, because you're like, yep, AI works, this is great, and you're not even actually critically, analyzing it. And I'm really fascinated by this. You kind of talked about the probabilistic responses, and they're really just kind of models that are that learn by example, and they just are trained to kind of give coherent answers that sort of sound good. There's a study that came out recently that I'm just like so fascinated by, and I've probably talked about it to 100 people at this point. But a study was done where they took all of these different business models, different products, different industries, blah, blah, blah. And they presented them to the AI models to say, come up with a business plan and like a business strategy for these things. And like every single one came up with a really smart business plan. And there was a clustering of like the same answer for all these different business
across
things.
Industries and verticals.
And they all sounded really good. Okay. They were all trained on McKinsey white papers and stuff like that. And so if you're not, if you're not super critical with those responses, and you're not actually saying, well, like, not just does this response sound good, but like, does this response make sense? And unless you're kind of equipped to like bring that sort of, that kind of like specialized criticality to those responses, the risk really does increase that we accept and run with a response that, while coherent, while sounds really good and seems backed up by like a lot of sources, might not actually be applicable to the question that we're answering in terms of like it being the actual right answer. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think that's, why it's so important to involve subject matter experts in the testing and accuracy evaluation processes, right?
And reevaluation, to your point.
And reevaluation processes. Thank you. See, everyone tends to forget. But yeah, developers can only test so far without the topical knowledge at hand, right? So they can get to, a general, what they read, as you said, sounds good, but is that the right answer? You need a subject matter expert to evaluate that and reevaluate that as time goes.
Yeah. I think that reevaluation is the hard thing. It's like, how often am I looking in this basket of good apples to make sure that like I should continue to trust these things?
Humans love checklists. They want to check it off, cross it off, and forget about it, right? That's just not something you can do with AI. It's revolutions, it's circles.
And you see this with like everything, like the rate at which people rebalance their 401k is like zero. It's like, cool, I got my 401k set up, and you just like wipe your hands of it and you put it over there into this, into this vault, really. It's a very interesting sort of human tendency that, again, I think creates some vulnerabilities from a governance perspective with respect to this new technology. So what do you think, like what excites you most with all this stuff, with all this AI and compliance, or this AI governance? Like what excites you most about it, and what kind of keeps you up at night as you're kind of looking into the future?
Yeah. So on the excite side, I can't understate this. AI for the first time gives non-technical folks, people, the ability to interact with computer systems via natural language. And that like capability is so groundbreaking and just like something that people don't pause and take a moment to reflect on. It genuinely democratizes a shift in how work gets done and what experience is needed to perform a given task.
Um, yeah, I mean that's it's like a democratization of like ability. It's like a
Exactly.
democratization of expertise and like a means by which and like almost a democratization of like production of knowledge work or something.
Right. And think, for the last 60 plus years since computers started becoming a thing, like there was a very limited segment of the population that could work with those and really understand what was going on. And that is completely opening up over the last 4 or 5 years and is going to continue to do so into the future exponentially.
So you did this global kind of governance certification. How has that education and that exposure to that process, how has that kind of changed or influenced or expanded your approach in terms of like how you think about this thing? Like how has that changed your scope of thought?
I think the biggest thing is just like kind of realizing that this is so far from an exact science. And so many early applications in general are kind of even more akin to like a guess and check methodology. So given this, like the testing and ongoing maintenance is vital that we talked about before, as well as training users on how to evaluate inputs, outputs, and then provide that feedback loop back to the developers so that things can improve.
Oh man, this has been so interesting. I just love talking about this stuff because, like I said, like we've said kind of multiple times during this conversation, it's such an opportunity. There's a ton of threats involved. It's so much change. I mean, this is like industrial revolution type change. It's like a once in a lifetime type of change. And I think
Absolutely.
there's a lot of opportunity for compliance to grab hold of this thing and kind of be part of the conversation, not only to make our own work better, but to also to make our workplaces better and, avoid some, massive catastrophes that can come from, use cases or users of this technology that maybe aren't really seeing around the curve or really don't understand, how an explosion might occur or something like that,
Yeah, exactly.
So, all right, as we wrap up here, I love this question because it's free advice for me. But if you could go back in time and give your younger self a piece of advice, what would that be?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a tough one, but I think for me, it's really just leaning into your strongest interests and voicing them relentlessly, especially to leadership. And most importantly, early on in your career, you want to create a path of work that you're generally interested in and passionate about. Without that, it's not nearly as fun and not nearly as intuitive, I would say. So, kind of doing that and finding a leader that can be a catalyst for your interests is extremely important. Whether that means moving teams, like me from sales to compliance, or a different company entirely, having the leader that supports your interests and your passions is extremely important.
I love it. That's great advice. We all have these gifts, right? We all have like a different perspective that we've accumulated with through our experiences and through, the skills that we've built. And when we are not confident, like you said, in bringing that voice to the conversation, we end up kind of turning into wallpaper, you know what I'm saying? Which is worse than a wallflower, frankly. We turn into wallpaper and, we're just kind of watching the world go by. And so I love that advice because especially with that mentorship or that kind of leader that can give you some of that backing or give you some of that confidence, it really does make our impact on the world, I think, a lot greater, the impact on our business a lot more meaningful. So
Absolutely. And
that's great
that
advice.
influence is something you can pass on to the next generation as well, which is
Totally.
extremely important.
Love it. Well, man, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a great conversation. Appreciate you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Nick. Really appreciate it.